Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about relationships, particularly those marked by deep emotional connection, what we're often observing underneath is a series of neurochemical exchanges that shape our perception, behavior, and ultimately our emotional experiences. One of the most powerful and misunderstood dynamics in this space is what happens neurologically when someone walks away from a relationship. Specifically, how the individual who is left behind begins to miss the person who walked away, sometimes intensely, irrationally, and even regretfully. At the core of this experience is the relationship between attachment and dopamine dynamics. In the context of attachment, our brains rely heavily on patterns and predictability. When we form bonds with someone, whether romantic or platonic, the brain develops a set of expectations. These expectations are deeply rooted in neural pathways that associate that person's presence, communication, and behaviors with specific neurochemical responses. Oxytocin, the so-called bonding hormone, plays a key role here. When we're consistently exposed to someone we care about, oxytocin levels increase, reinforcing feelings of trust and attachment. At the same time, dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with reward, motivation, and craving, is being released in intermittent bursts, especially during moments of emotional intensity, novelty, or positive reinforcement with respond to reward. Now, here's where the neurobiology becomes particularly interesting. In a stable relationship, the brain becomes used to certain patterns, daily messages, shared routines, moments of intimacy. The dopamine system calibrates to this routine, and the brain comes to anticipate these interactions as part of its regular reward schedule. But when one person walks away, especially suddenly or with emotional clarity, this expected pattern is disrupted. The brain is no longer receiving the anticipated dopamine rewards tied to interaction with that person. And because the system had adapted to expect them, this lack of input doesn't just go unnoticed, it triggers a profound neurochemical reaction. In essence, the brain begins to crave what it no longer receives. This is often experienced subjectively as missing someone, but it's not merely emotional, it's biological. From a neuroscience perspective, this can be understood as a kind of withdrawal. In relationships with regular emotional and physical intimacy, the brain's reward system becomes finely tuned to the presence of the other person. When they leave, especially if the departure is final or unexpected, the dopaminergic system experiences a shortfall. And it's not just a matter of absence, it's a sudden break in the feedback loop that had been reinforcing certain emotional behaviors. The craving that follows is not just for the person, but for the neurochemical stimulation their presence used to provide. What amplifies this even further is the variable reward nature of many relationships. In behavioral science, we know that intermittent reinforcement where rewards are given unpredictably leads to stronger conditioning than constant, predictable rewards. If a relationship had elements of emotional inconsistency, sometimes validating, sometimes withdrawing, the dopaminergic system may have become even more sensitized. When the person who provided these highs walks away, the brain, primed by inconsistency, amplifies the craving in an attempt to reestablish the reward pattern. Moreover, this dynamic often leads to a kind of mental magnification. The brain, in the absence of new input from the former partner, begins to replay emotional memories. And because dopamine is involved in memory consolidation, particularly emotional memory, the moments of joy or intimacy get highlighted and replayed disproportionately. This results in a kind of emotional editing where the lows or conflicts are minimized in mental recall and the highs are exaggerated. The brain, seeking dopamine through memory, fixates on the most emotionally charged moments, reinforcing the sensation of loss. This entire cycle is further complicated by stress hormones like cortisol, which elevate during emotional pain or uncertainty. High cortisol can disrupt rational processing in the prefrontal cortex, making it harder to contextualize the loss or move on logically. Instead, the individual feels stuck in a feedback loop where missing the person becomes more about trying to reestablish a neurochemical balance than it is about the actual relationship dynamic. Scarcity is one of the most powerful psychological and neurological principles that shape how we assign value. From a neurobiological perspective, the human brain is not wired to evaluate things purely based on objective utility. Instead, it assigns value dynamically, often based on availability, novelty, and potential threat of loss. This is why the moment something becomes scarce, whether it's time, attention, or a person, it often feels more important, more valuable, and paradoxically more desirable. This mechanism is rooted in survival-based evolutionary pressures, and it deeply influences our social and emotional behavior. In neuroscience, this can be understood through the lens of relative value coding. The brain doesn't process value in absolute terms, but rather in contrast to what is currently accessible or abundant. When something is readily available, the brain tends to normalize its presence and assign it less emotional weight over time. This phenomenon, known as hedonic adaptation, means that we rapidly adjust to consistent positive stimuli and stop registering them as intensely rewarding. In relationships, this is often why people become emotionally complacent. They adapt to the presence of the other person, and the reward system begins to downregulate its response to them. Now, introduce scarcity, such as someone leaving, becoming emotionally unavailable, or reducing their presence, and the brain's evaluation shifts dramatically. The absence creates contrast. What was previously taken for granted now stands out starkly in memory and perception. Dopaminergic systems, which are closely involved in reward and motivation, become re-engaged. Interestingly, dopamine doesn't spike just in response to a pleasurable stimulus, but more robustly in anticipation of an uncertain or hard-to-get reward. This is precisely why the brain reacts so strongly to someone who is no longer accessible. Their scarcity increases the perceived value, even if their actual contributions to well-being or emotional health were previously neutral or even negative. This ties closely to the orbitofrontal cortex, a region of the brain that plays a role in decision-making and value assignment. When the brain encounters reduced availability of something it previously had access to, the orbitofrontal cortex recalibrates its assessment of that thing's worth. Emotionally, this creates the illusion that the person who walked away is now far more significant than they might have seemed while they were still present. It's not necessarily about who they were, but rather what their absence now symbolizes: uncertainty, incompletion, and a loss of emotional grounding. Furthermore, scarcity engages deeper survival circuits. Evolutionarily, social bonds were critical to human survival. Being excluded or losing a tribe member could have meant literal danger or resource loss. Our brains are still tuned to those ancient stakes. So when someone leaves, it doesn't simply register as a loss of affection. It activates a primal fear of exclusion or isolation, which further amplifies the desire to reclaim or reconnect. This isn't conscious, it's a biological imperative operating beneath awareness, often driving behaviors that seem irrational in hindsight. Importantly, the more selective or rare the person seemed to be in their emotional availability, the more the scarcity mechanism becomes amplified. If someone was unpredictable, withheld affection, or gave intermittent validation, their eventual absence tends to trigger an even greater valuation in the brain of the person left behind. This is due to a principle known in behavioral science as intermittent reinforcement, which is known to create the strongest forms of attachment, similar to addiction loops. When the brain doesn't know when or if the reward, in this case emotional connection, will return, it over-prioritizes the stimulus. The result is obsessive thinking, increased emotional longing, and a distorted sense of value. In practical terms, this means the person who walked away often becomes an object of fixation, not because they were inherently more valuable than others, but because their absence activated a scarcity-based valuation system. The emotional brain, governed largely by the limbic system and midbrain structures like the ventral tegmental area, VITA, becomes hyperactive in scanning for cues of potential return or reconnection. This state can dominate cognition, leading individuals to ruminate, idealize the absent person, and devalue other connections or opportunities. The cognitive dissonance between what we rationally know and what we emotionally feel is a direct consequence of these competing neural systems. Predictive coding is a foundational principle in neuroscience that explains how the brain continuously generates and updates a model of the world based on past experiences, sensory input, and anticipated outcomes. Rather than passively reacting to the world, the brain is constantly predicting what will happen next and adjusting those predictions in real time. This mechanism is especially important in social and emotional contexts where prediction errors, instances where reality does not match expectation, can lead to strong effective responses. When it comes to relationships, predictive coding becomes deeply intertwined with emotional memory, shaping how we interpret others' actions, how we form attachment patterns, and ultimately how we respond to separation or loss. The brain is always trying to minimize uncertainty and error between what it expects to happen and what actually occurs. In close relationships, repeated emotional experiences create highly specific predictions about another person's behavior. For example, if someone regularly sends back not just a memory, but the full emotional weight of a past relationship, the brain is essentially running a prediction model in reverse, reactivating the states that were previously associated with a specific person. When someone walks away or becomes absent from our lives, the brain's predictive model is disrupted. This creates what is known as a prediction error, mismatch between expected relational inputs and actual sensory reality. Where a morning text or a certain tone of voice was once expected, there is now silence. This mismatch is not benign. It forces the brain to update its model, but the emotional memory systems resist rapid change, especially when the relationship was meaningful or intense. The brain struggles between clinging to the old predictions and adapting to a new reality where the person is no longer present. This internal conflict can be psychologically distressing. Emotional memory resists the update because the neural circuits involved, particularly those governed by dopamine and oxytocin, have invested in the expectation of continued connection. The longer and more emotionally charged the relationship was, the more deeply entrenched the predictive model becomes. Updating it is not just a cognitive shift, it involves rewiring the neurochemical associations that were once tied to feelings of safety, intimacy, and validation. An especially powerful aspect of predictive coding in relationships is that the brain often fills in gaps with idealized memories. In the absence of new input from the person who has walked away, the brain relies more heavily on memory to sustain its model. But these memories are not neutral, they are filtered through emotion, often amplifying positive moments and minimizing negative ones. This selective recall enhances the illusion that the person was more consistent, more loving, or more irreplaceable than they may have actually been. The emotional brain, biased by past reward signals, keeps predicting connection even when logic suggests otherwise. This misalignment between prediction and reality often shows up in behaviors like checking a phone compulsively, scanning social media, or interpreting neutral stimuli as signs of reconnection. These actions are not just habits, they are attempts by the brain to reduce prediction error. If a message does appear, it momentarily resolves the uncertainty and rewards the system with a small hit of dopamine. If no message comes, the prediction error increases, further destabilizing emotional regulation. Over time, if the person does not return, the brain is forced to reconcile its predictions with ongoing reality. But this reconciliation is rarely immediate. The emotional memory system, especially when it has been reinforced over time, is slow to release its grip. Even after the cognitive brain acknowledges the absence, the deeper emotional systems may continue to fire in ways that assume the person will reappear or that they still hold the same emotional relevance. This results in a prolonged state of emotional dissonance where the brain is caught between what it feels should happen and what is actually happening. Autonomy, in its purest psychological and neurobiological form, is the expression of self-governance, one's ability to make decisions, take actions, and assert boundaries in alignment with inner values rather than external pressures. In the context of relationships, autonomy often plays a paradoxical role. While closeness and emotional intimacy are vital for connection, it is autonomy, especially when exercised calmly and without drama, that has the power to shift dynamics in profound ways. When one person walks away or sets a boundary, not from anger or emotional reactivity, but from a grounded sense of self-worth, it tends to trigger a recalibration in the mind of the other person. This shift is not just psychological, it is deeply neurological and often unfolds beneath conscious awareness. From a neurobiological perspective, when someone maintains their autonomy, particularly in emotionally charged situations, their behavior is processed differently in the brain of the observer. Instead of being interpreted through the lens of conflict or threat, it is perceived as an act of integrity and strength. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for higher order thinking, evaluates this behavior not as abandonment but as a demonstration of clarity. Simultaneously, the limbic system, which is more emotionally reactive, begins to associate that person not with desperation or emotional volatility, but with self-regulation and personal power. This reframing increases psychological value. The individual who walks away from a situation that no longer aligns with their emotional well-being is not interpreted as someone who lacks connection. They are interpreted as someone who understands their worth. What often happens next is a process of delayed realization. In the immediate aftermath of someone choosing autonomy, whether it's stepping back, walking away, or refusing to chase, there may be confusion, even anger from the person on the receiving end. This is a typical response to a break in relational predictability. However, with time and space, the emotional brain begins to reprocess the interaction. Autonomy creates a form of scarcity, and as scarcity increases, value perception changes. But more importantly, autonomy triggers reflection. When someone does not react, does not argue, does not beg for closeness, the other person is left alone with their own thoughts. There is no external emotional noise to distract or deflect. This quiet is where the brain begins to reflect and often to reconsider. Respect, neurologically speaking, is not just an abstract moral quality. It arises from the activation of neural circuits related to appraisal and reward. When someone maintains composure under emotional strain, it activates these circuits in the observer's brain. What once might have been interpreted as ordinary or even frustrating becomes remarkable. In contrast to emotional dependence, autonomy signals strength and internal stability, qualities that the brain associates with safety and leadership. From an evolutionary standpoint, we are drawn to those who demonstrate composure under pressure because these traits historically indicated someone capable of survival, protection, and wise decision-making. In intimate relationships, this wiring still applies. Autonomy is not just seen, it is felt as a signal of inner security. The shift triggered by autonomy is further amplified by the contrast effect. When someone was previously available, reactive, or emotionally entangled in the relationship dynamic, their sudden emotional neutrality or detachment stands in sharp contrast. This contrast creates a strong cognitive and emotional imprint. The brain uses contrast to emphasize change. The person who previously engaged in conflict or over-explaining suddenly chooses silence or distance. That change disrupts the other person's emotional expectations and forces a reassessment of who that individual actually is. The one who was once taken for granted becomes the one who must now be understood in a new light. Reflection also takes place through the activation of memory consolidation mechanisms, especially during periods of emotional absence. As the emotionally detached person refrains from reaching out or seeking validation, the other brain begins to sift through past experiences to make sense of what happened. This search activates emotional memory networks, particularly those in the hippocampus and amygdala, which tag and retrieve emotionally significant moments. What is often remembered are not the arguments or the discomforts, but the emotional warmth, support, or understanding that was previously present. In the absence of new negative input, and in the presence of stark autonomy, the brain selectively recalls what was lost, not just in terms of the person, but in terms of what they represented. This forms the foundation for emotional regret, which in turn often leads to a retroactive increase in respect. What autonomy ultimately does is interrupt the emotional transaction loop. The person who steps back no longer reinforces the other's need for control, validation, or emotional reassurance. This disruption forces the other brain to begin generating internal answers rather than relying on external cues. In doing so, they often realize not only what they missed, but who they underestimated. Autonomy introduces uncertainty, and the brain is compelled to resolve uncertainty through reevaluation. This is not an act of manipulation, it is a neurological recalibration that emerges when one person acts from self-respect rather than emotional reactivity. The Zeigarnik effect, named after Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, refers to the psychological tendency to remember incomplete or interrupted tasks more vividly than those that have been completed. Originally observed in the context of waiters recalling unpaid orders better than paid ones, this phenomenon extends far beyond cognitive recall. It has deep implications for how humans process emotional experiences, particularly those that are unresolved. In the realm of relationships, the Zeigarnik effect becomes especially potent, turning unfinished emotional loops into unknowing psychological burdens that the brain struggles to let go of. At its core, the brain is a prediction machine. It thrives on patterns, closures, and outcomes. When an emotional event is left open-ended, such as a breakup without closure, a conversation that ends in ambiguity, or a sudden ghosting, the mind perceives this as an incomplete task. But unlike forgotten to-do lists or unsubmitted assignments, unfinished exchanges are encoded not just cognitively but effectively. That means they are tied to emotional memory circuits involving the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. As a result, they are revisited with greater emotional intensity and far more persistence. The emotional brain seeks resolution. When someone walks away without explanation, or when a relationship dissolves without mutual understanding or clarity, the brain enters a loop. It replays conversations, reanalyzes gestures, and rehearses alternative outcomes, not simply out of longing, but because the neural networks involved in memory, prediction, and emotional regulation are trying to close the loop. The Zeigarnik effect drives this repetition, creating an almost obsessive need to understand why something happened, especially when the emotional investment was significant. In unresolved emotional situations, the dopamine system continues to stay engaged, not because of the presence of reward, but due to the possibility of resolution. The brain continues to seek an outcome, to grasp a pattern that makes sense, and that search becomes self-reinforcing. This is why people often feel stuck, checking for messages that never come, rereading old texts, or imagining future scenarios in which closure might finally occur. The loop is driven less by hope and more by the brain's demand for cognitive and emotional finality. Importantly, the emotional Zeigarnik loop doesn't just affect conscious thought, it shapes unconscious behavior. People may avoid new relationships, fear vulnerability, or develop attachment anxieties as a direct result of these unresolved patterns. The emotional weight of the unfinished becomes embedded in the brain's internal model of relationships. Future interactions are filtered through the lens of past incompletions, often without the individual even realizing it. This shows how the brain, in its attempt to resolve what's unfinished, ends up carrying forward the emotional residue into new contexts. Sleep and memory consolidation also interact with the Zeigarnik effect in powerful ways. During REM sleep, the brain tries to integrate emotional experiences, resolving conflicts and filing away memories. But emotionally unfinished stories often resist this integration. Instead of being processed and stored as neutralized memory, they are flagged as resolved, resurfacing in dreams or in sudden moments of emotional recall. The hippocampus, which encodes memory, continues to interact with the amygdala, which colors those memories with emotional salience. The result is a memory loop that feels fresh and vivid, even months or years after the original event. This lingering effect is why emotional closure is such a powerful need, even when logically we understand that we may never receive it. The Zeigarnik effect turns emotional absence into mental presence. The person who left, the conversation that never happened, the apology that was never given, these become far louder in the mind than any moment of resolution ever could. And because the loop lacks an endpoint, the emotional brain continues to prioritize that story above others, reinforcing its importance not through truth, but through repetition and salience. Self-worth, the intrinsic sense of one's own value, is not merely a psychological construct. It is a deeply neurobiological process shaped by experience, environment, and repeated patterns of thought and behavior. At the core of this process lies neuroplasticity, the brain's innate ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. These two forces, self-worth and neuroplasticity, exist in a constant feedback loop. The more someone affirms their value through thought and action, the more the brain wires itself to support that belief. Conversely, experiences that diminish self-worth can physically reinforce neural patterns that keep a person stuck in cycles of self-doubt, emotional dependency, or fear of rejection. Neuroplasticity is experience-dependent, meaning it is shaped by what we repeatedly focus on and engage with. When someone experiences consistent validation, affection, and respect in early relationships, their brain forms circuits that associate connection with safety and worthiness. These pathways are reinforced over time, creating a baseline expectation that others will treat them with care and that they, in turn, deserve such treatment. But when the opposite occurs, repeated experiences of neglect, criticism, or emotional inconsistency, the brain adapts as well, forming connections that equate love with unpredictability or validation with achievement. These early neurological templates become internal models that influence adult relationships, often leading people to unconsciously recreate the conditions that match their neural expectations, even when those conditions are painful. One of the most powerful aspects of neuroplasticity is that it does not stop in childhood. While early experiences lay down the initial wiring, the adult brain retains a lifelong capacity to change. This is particularly important when considering self-worth, as it suggests that even deeply ingrained beliefs about one's inadequacy or unlovability can be reshaped. The process begins with awareness, but is sustained by action, by repeatedly engaging in thoughts, behaviors, and environments that challenge old narratives and support new ones. Each time a person sets a The brain begins to understand at a structural level that self-worth is not something to be earned or proven, but something to be recognized and reinforced from within through ongoing choice and repeated action. Time delay and emotional contrast effect form a potent psychological and neurobiological mechanism, particularly in the context of human relationships, attachment, and loss. When someone steps away from a relationship, whether intentionally or by circumstance, the passage of time does not simply mark absence. It begins a recalibration process in the brain that is often misunderstood. During this time delay, the brain is not passive. Instead, it engages in a series of reappraisals, memory consolidations, and emotional projections that tend to boundary, chooses self-care over self-sacrifice, or rejects emotional manipulation. They reinforce a neural pathway that supports autonomy and value. These changes may be subtle at first, but over time they create structural and functional shifts in the brain, particularly in regions like the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. Emotional regulation and self-assessment. The relationship between self-worth and neuroplasticity is especially evident in how people respond to loss or rejection. When someone who was emotionally invested in another person is suddenly faced with that person's absence, especially if the separation was abrupt or devoid of closure, the immediate response may be one of destabilization. The brain, trained to associate the other person with feelings of significance or belonging, experiences a void, but what happens next depends largely on the state of the individual's internal narrative. If their self-worth is externalized, dependent on how others perceive or treat them, the brain will loop on questions of why they weren't enough, what they did wrong, or how they can fix the situation. These loops are driven by previously wired pathways that associate abandonment with personal failure. However, if the person has begun the process of internalizing self-worth, understanding that their value is not contingent on someone else's approval or attention, the brain can begin to form new associations. This is where neuroplasticity becomes the mechanism of healing. Rather than reinforcing a trauma loop, the individual starts creating a new template, one where emotional pain is acknowledged but not equated with identity. Through conscious effort, meditation, therapy, journaling, reframing thoughts, practicing gratitude, the individual begins to prune away the neural pathways that supported unworthiness and builds new ones, rooted in self-respect and emotional resilience. This is not a one-time event, but a cumulative process. Repetition is key. Each new thought or action that supports a positive self-concept strengthens synaptic connections that make future similar thoughts and behaviors more likely. Importantly, the neurotransmitters involved in self-perception also play a role. Dopamine, for instance, reinforces actions that lead to perceived reward. When self-affirming behavior is linked with positive outcomes, peace, clarity, progress, the brain starts to reward those actions with a sense of satisfaction. Over time, a person begins to crave activities and environments that support their self-worth and avoid those that compromise it. Oxytocin, which is involved in social bonding, can also begin to flow not just in connection with others, but in acts of self-soothing and self-compassion. This chemical shift supports the development of a stable emotional baseline that doesn't rise and fall with external validation. Amplify perceived value, particularly when the separation follows a pattern of emotional intensity or inconsistency. The emotional contrast effect refers to the brain's tendency to magnify the difference between two emotional states when experienced sequentially. In simpler terms, something will feel more pleasurable or more painful depending on what came before it. This principle applies sharply in relationships when someone who was once consistently present becomes absent. The emotional system registers the drop in relational input not as neutral, but as a significant and painful contrast to the prior state of closeness or engagement. The brain encodes this change. And self-compassion. This chemical shift supports the development of a stable emotional baseline that doesn't rise and fall with external validation. Amplify perceived value, particularly when the separation follows a pattern of emotional intensity or inconsistency. The emotional contrast effect refers to the brain's tendency to magnify the difference between two emotional states when experienced sequentially. In simpler terms, something will feel more pleasurable or more painful depending on what came before it. This principle applies sharply in relationships when someone who was once consistently present becomes absent. The emotional system registers the drop in relational input not as neutral, but as a significant and painful contrast to the prior state of closeness or engagement. The brain encodes this change, not merely as a loss, but as deprivation. What was once ordinary now becomes emotionally salient, and the shift creates the foundation for longing, reflection, and often regret. Neurobiologically, time delay allows for the development of emotional contrast by giving the brain space to recalibrate its internal baseline. In the presence of someone, especially someone who provides emotional stimulation, validation, or excitement, the brain adapts to their presence through dopaminergic pathways. The reward system becomes accustomed to their input. This person becomes integrated into the brain's predictive model. The emotional system expects their messages, tone of voice, physical proximity, or attention. When this input is suddenly removed and not replaced, the dopaminergic system begins to misfire. The brain continues to anticipate a reward signal that no longer arrives, increasing emotional sensitivity and heightening the salience of the absent person. What time adds to this process is psychological depth. The more time that passes without contact or closure, the more the brain begins to engage in idealization. Memory is inherently reconstructive, not reproductive. That means the mind does not store experiences exactly as they occurred, but rather reconstructs them based on present emotional states, expectations, and needs. During time apart, the mind begins to fill in the gaps with emotionally weighted projections. Positive memories are often amplified, while negative ones are softened or reinterpreted. This is not because of willful denial, but because the emotional brain is trying to make sense of a missing variable in its model of attachment. This distortion enhances the contrast between the current emotional state of lack and the prior emotional state of connection, making the lost presence seem even more valuable than it may have felt in real time. And heightening the salience of the absent person. What time adds to this process is psychological depth. The more time that passes without contact or closure, the more the brain begins to engage in idealization. Memory is inherently reconstructive, not reproductive. That means the mind does not store experiences exactly as they occurred, but rather reconstructs them based on present emotional states, expectations, and needs. During time apart, the mind begins to fill in the gaps with emotionally weighted projections. Positive memories are often amplified, while negative ones are softened or reinterpreted. This is not because of willful denial, but because the emotional brain is trying to make sense of a missing variable in its model of attachment. This distortion enhances the contrast between the current emotional state of lack and the prior emotional state of connection, making the lost presence seem even more valuable than it may have felt in real time. Additionally, the prefrontal cortex, which governs executive function and meaning making, becomes more involved as time passes. Reflection is a cognitive function that takes time to unfold. In the immediate aftermath of a breakup or emotional detachment, people often operate from the limbic system, reactive, emotionally driven, and anchored in survival responses. As time moves forward and emotional intensity begins to settle, the prefrontal cortex starts to reinterpret events, actions, and decisions. This reinterpretation often reveals patterns that were invisible in the moment, such as the other person's quiet acts of care or the emotional weight of their presence. The brain begins to reconstruct a narrative where the absent person becomes a symbol not just of what was lost, but of something emotionally irreplaceable.